IVM.
Simblified is an IVM production, and if you like our show, you must also check out Shunya One, hosted by entrepreneur Shiladitya Mukhopadhyay. Every week, he, along with some esteemed guests, discuss headlines from the world of technology and business. New episodes out every Tuesday on ivmpodcast.com and the IVM Podcast app.
Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of Simplified. And this time it's a unique episode because you're getting pure, unadulterated Narendra, which is not a good thing, I know. But Chuck and Srikeit aren't here. For some reasons, they're not very upfront about what it is. I sort of suspect that somebody slipped them the crazy glue in place of the Vaseline. That's why. Otherwise, why would both of them not be able to come? So it's very, very suspicious. And Chuck and Srikeit, remember the scanner is on you and keep your nefarious activities toned down. And yeah, it's a strange feeling. I'm sitting here and trying to be funny, a thing that I'm not. So instead of trying to force myself to be funny, I think I'll just get on with my topic for the day, which is a shortie. And as you know, shorties make you a little smarter as opposed to our regular long episodes, which make you a lot smarter than you were to begin with. And this shortie is about the glorious bracing smell you get at the seaside. And I live in Malad West, and close to our house runs a creek, which smells, how shall I put it? It's unique, right? It has been variously described as notes of mustard and boiling cabbage, and as one of my cousins said, no, it's like the fresh fart of somebody who has dined well. So those smells, you can imagine that those smells. And it's a smell that we are used to from our childhood, and we always liked that smell because we were told that that is ozone, so it is good for you. So apparently it's a load of nonsense. Yeah, it's not. And we believed actually because we were young and we were silly, and we had read in many places that the smell of the seaside is indeed ozone and it's good for you. And it's a tale that is quite old. So in the advertising blurbs of companies, there have been many companies which sold ozone products, and they continue to sell ozone products. You get all these ionizers and things like that, which promise to make you healthy by giving you ozone. And in the 19th century and the early 20th century in Europe and America, there were ozone hospitals. So you go to a hospital, check in, and breathe a lot of ozone. And even ozone cages at the seaside. And all this was specifically for, enabling people to get healthy ozone ocean air. And even today in the 21st century, I found out that the Collins Dictionary defines ozone as the clean bracing air as found at the seaside. That's actually there in the dictionary as a definition of ozone. And there's another dictionary called a Macquarie Dictionary, which calls it clear, invigorating fresh air. And there is a clinic in Israel, a famous one. It's called the RAN clinic. And it's in an Israeli city called Arad. And it actually offers the healthful effects of ozone as part of its natural therapy. Israel is a big thing for natural. They have this Dead Sea, and you basically go and you lie in the mud, and then you come back and you tell everybody that you're actually looking beautiful, and everyone very politely refrains from commenting on it, but you're actually not beautiful. But that's beside the point. Anyway, so that's the myth about ozone, and we know that it's a myth because of the efforts of a lot of scientists who actually went around poking into marshes and things like that to find out what was that smell actually. So one of the pioneers is a guy named Andrew Johnston from the University of East Anglia in UK, and he says we were misled twice over. Firstly, the distinctive seaside smell is not ozone. It is something called dimethyl sulfide. And secondly, because inhaling it is not necessarily good for you. Whether it's dimethyl sulfide or even if it were ozone, it would not be good for you. And he's not the first person to note that the smell is not ozone, but he was instrumental in making it common knowledge. So, when he said that, it got published in papers and everyone knew that it was something called dimethyl sulfide and not ozone. So what about ozone then? Well, ozone is a funny creature. It is the threesome of the atomic world. So all decent oxygen atoms they live in pairs, and they are very sanskari, so no one lives alone as well. But every now and then, in the presence of an electric spark, a little bit of madness comes about, and 3 oxygen atoms cohabit very closely and become very intimate, and they hang around. And as I was saying, it's a threesome, a very exciting one, I'm sure. And I'm sure atoms nudge other atoms and say, don't look now, but there's that, there's a bunch of 3. Have you seen 3 oxygen atoms and all that? And then they come close by and very politely all the atoms look the other way. Something like that happens in the nanoscale, I'm sure. Anyway, the odor of ozone was first noticed around electrical machines. And electrical machines are not very new. They are not very old, they're fairly new. So when people discovered how to make voltages, and obviously sparks started happening, and they found out there was a funny smell. And there was this German guy named Christian Friedrich Schonbein who made ozone, who figured out that it's something strange, and he tried to concoct it by passing electricity through water. And he called it ozine, Ozein. And that was the Greek word for smell, and then it became ozone. And that is a strange odor that you sometimes smell in a lightning storm. I've never really smelt ozone, so I don't know what it's like. But I've smelt lightning storms, and I can sort of imagine it. It's a little acrid, chlorinish kind of smell. And the fact that it was made out of 3 oxygen atoms, the guy who found out that it was a threesome was sometime around 1872. And it became famous over the past few decades because they also discovered that there's a big layer of ozone in the stratosphere which absorbs a lot of ultraviolet radiation and makes the planet safe for us. And they also found out that there's a gas called freon, I think, which just destroys. So the freon goes and it's like the moral police of the atomic world. So all these ozone atoms have to break up the fun, and then they all become twosomes and they go away. And those things were ubiquitous because they were used in aerosols and they were used in refrigerators. So every time an aerosol or refrigerator leaked, you'd end up having a really big gap in the ozone layer, which meant a lot of harmful radiation would come in. And that and many other things led people to believe that ozone was actually good for them. And that's partly why people talked about, ozone. But apparently ozone is not good. So if you take a can full of ozone and inhale it, you'll be pretty much dead. And other part of that Andrew Johnston's statement that it's not even ozone, then what is it? It is dimethyl sulfide. And this dimethyl sulfide is a very interesting thing. Okay, so dimethyl sulfide is a clear inflammable liquid that boils at 37 degrees but can exist as a gas at even lower temperatures. And it is given off when you boil corn and cabbage and in a different concentration for the characteristic smells of Brussels sprouts. So I have not eaten Brussels sprouts, but I know people, it's very common in the US and all kids hate it. So it must be some foul smelling stuff. And smell of boiling cabbage, that I know what it smells like, and it's not pleasant. And it has been a special favorite of my favorite author, P.G. Wodehouse, who is a recurrent theme in many. So whenever Wodehouse talks about a character who's one arty type who writes poetry, it's always poetry about rotting corpses and boiling cabbage. And there's a novel called Service with a Smile, and there's this character named Lavender Briggs. And her day is described as having gone to the opening performance at the Flaming Youth Group Center, of one of those avant-garde plays which brings the scent of boiling cabbage across the footlights, and in which the little man in the bowler hat turns out to be God. So those kind of plays. In my youth, I've been around in those theatre group things. One random script, it'll be nothing happens. Suddenly somebody screams. And one random guy will be a plumber or something, and it turns out it's God. And there's another story, one of my favorite, called A Fiery Wooing of Mordred Mulliner. So in that also, this guy is a writer of stark poetry, which does not rhyme and which talks primarily of rotting corpses and boiling cabbages. And then he falls in love. Then he has to write poetry which rhymes with moon and June and talks about love. So he's very sad about it. And what else? Dimethyl sulfide also appears as an unpleasant contaminant in my favorite beverage, namely beer. And the remedy there is to have a good sanitation procedure and to maintain a rolling, uncovered boil when brewing the beer. So beer is a very, very tricky thing. We did an episode many episodes back about the awesomeness of beer and craft beer and things like that. And it's an art. So one of the arts of brewing beer is the art of not making it smell like shit. So that is dimethyl sulfide. And the interesting part about dimethyl sulfide is this. It originates in the ocean. And many creatures that live in the ocean generate it from their metabolic processes. And it's a chemical called DMSP, or to give, as Chuck would have said, to give it its full Christian name, dimethyl sulfonopropionate. That's what it's called. And that loses the P, the propionate part, and it becomes DMS. These creatures then dump the DMS into the ocean around them. And what usually happens is the smallest creatures generate all this when they are under distress. And they'll usually be under distress because some predator is attacking them. So the very, very, very small creatures, which are called phytoplankton, they are attacked by a larger creature called a zooplankton. And moment that happens, otherwise, I've always wondered, ocean is pretty featureless. It's just one big expanse of sea and there's nothing to distinguish it from anything else. And there'll be always birds roaming around and know exactly where to find fish. So one of the clues is this. When these creatures are in distress, they'll be emitting dimethyl sulfide, and the birds can smell that, and they go there, and then they see whoever is attacking them, usually small crustaceans, a shrimp or something, and then they go feed on that. And two of the expert birds at this are called petrels and shearwaters. Yeah, petrels and shearwaters. And so that's the food chain in operation. So one guy's meal is one guy's enemy is somebody else's meal. Yeah. And even tiny creatures like bacteria release dimethyl sulfide. In fact, a huge quantity of DMS is released from the ocean, and about 30 to 50 million tons per year. Okay. The ocean makes some 50% of all the biological sulfur in the world, and about 90% of that is DMS. And scientists have been trying to figure out how the genes of various bacteria do that. So bacteria don't necessarily breathe oxygen like the rest of us. They metabolize different things. So a lot of ocean-dwelling bacteria metabolize nitrogen, and they sort of emit DMS. So that's how, when they were researching bacteria, that is when they found out so much DMS was released, and that is when Andrew Johnston figured out that is the smell and not ozone. And the most interesting thing I found about DMS is clouds and climate change. So what happens is, it rises from the ocean where various creatures make it, and they oxidize to make tiny floating particles. So sulfide gets an oxygen atom, and presumably not one of the threesome guys, the regular guys, and it becomes a sulfate. And these sulfates are very, very, very small. So it's almost like an aerosol. And they seem to be the major source of what are called cloud condensation nuclei. It's also called CCN. So the CCN trigger the production of clouds. So some years ago when we had a drought, there was something called seeding the atmosphere. So there were planes going around spraying stuff into the atmosphere, trying to condense clouds. So they were, they were seeding it with aerosols of sulfate. And these cloud condensation nuclei trigger the production of clouds. And what happens is they start reflecting the sun. So once the cloud forms, the sunlight doesn't penetrate, it bounces back. So what is inside tends to become, on the other side of the cloud, tends to become more steamy. And the water vapor grows and the clouds grow. And that's how clouds form and rain falls. And one paper suggests that if the numbers of the CCN doubled, it could counteract the warming caused by doubling the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's still not proven, the jury is still out, but if it is so, then DMS will help control the climate and maybe abate the warming. So to sum things up, the next time somebody says that the seaside is braising because of ozone, you can tell them, Sniffy, that it's not ozone. Ozones are just dirty oxygen atoms having illicit threesomes. And what it really is dimethyl sulfide. So stay cool, stay tuned, and see you soon for our next episode, which will be a longer one, which will make you much smarter than this one has. And bye for now.
There she stands, a podcast addict, outside the bank, having travelled several miles to get in with other poor souls like her. The journey, though daunting for this youngling, will have some comfort because she has downloaded her favourite podcast. You can see more of her species on ivmpodcasts.com, your one-stop destination where you can check out the coolest Indian podcasts. Happy listening.